The United States Army has survived ambushes, blizzards, and budget hearings. But nothing prepared Fort Ashcroft for the day. A ship dropped out of the clouds and flattened the most heavily guarded food court on the planet in under 4 minutes. Grown men who never flinched under fire ran from a taco stand. This is that story, and it only gets stranger from here. Like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment if you are ready to see the Army get its revenge. Fort Ashcroft was not famous for its runway, its firing range, or its command center. It was famous for its food court. Soldiers called it Liberty Court, and every new recruit heard the same joke on their first week. You need a higher security badge to get a burrito at Liberty Court than you need to walk into the missile bunker next door. It was not really a joke. Liberty Court sat inside 3 layers of fencing, had its own guard rotation, and required a scan badge just to walk through the door. The official reason was that senior officers ate there during classified briefings, and nobody wanted a stray reporter wandering in with a sandwich order and a hidden microphone. The unofficial reason, the one every private repeated with a grin, was that command had learned the hard way that soldiers with bad food make bad decisions, and a fed soldier is a happy soldier. And a happy soldier does not write angry letters to Congress. Staff Sergeant Jack Coleman did not care about the politics of it. He cared about the coffee. Every morning at 0600, he walked into Liberty Court, nodded at the same guard, and ordered the same black coffee from the same tired counter worker. A woman named Carol, who had been serving Army coffee since before half the base was born. Coleman was the kind of man who said little and noticed everything, the sort of sergeant who could tell a private was lying about push-ups just by the way he breathed. He had 2 soldiers who followed him everywhere that morning like a matched set of trouble. Corporal Ryan Walsh was quiet, sharp, and allergic to unnecessary noise, the type of man who fixed problems instead of talking about them. Private Tommy Briggs was the opposite in every possible way, loud, hungry, and convinced that every meal was a personal event worth narrating out loud. That particular morning, Briggs stood in line holding 2 trays because he claimed one tray was for later, which nobody believed. Specialist Mike Turner and Private Danny Cooper sat at the corner table already, arguing about whether pineapple belonged on pizza. A debate that had apparently been running since basic training and showed no sign of ending. Lieutenant Robert Hayes walked in with his usual folder tucked under one arm, the same folder he carried everywhere, filled with schedules nobody asked to see. Hayes was young for his rank, sharp in uniform, and permanently exhausted by the chaos that seemed to orbit Second Squad wherever they went. The morning felt ordinary. That was the problem. Nobody in Liberty Court noticed the sky outside had gone the color of an old bruise until the windows started to hum. Coleman felt at first a vibration through his boots that had nothing to do with trucks or training exercises. He set his coffee down slowly and looked toward the ceiling. Briggs, mid-bite, asked if anyone else felt that. Turner told him to stop talking with his mouth full. Then the hum became a whine, and the whine became a roar, and every light in Liberty Court flickered once before dying completely. Outside, something enormous tore through the morning clouds, black and angular, moving with a silence that should not have belonged to something so large. It did not look like anything from any air show, any briefing, any classified folder Hayes had ever carried. It descended over the fence line, over the guard towers, over 3 layers of security clearance that had never once failed in the history of the base. And it landed directly on top of the outer checkpoint, as if the checkpoint were made of cardboard. Alarms shrieked across Fort Ashcroft. Soldiers scrambled for weapons that were locked in racks 2 buildings away, because nobody carries a loaded rifle to lunch. Coleman was already moving, shoving Briggs toward the back exit, shouting for Walsh to get the civilians out through the kitchen. Hayes fumbled for his radio, his folder falling out of his arm and scattering paperwork across the floor nobody would ever pick up again. The far wall of Liberty Court did not explode so much as it simply stopped existing. A section of reinforced concrete, rated to survive small arms fire, buckled inward like wet cardboard, and through the settling dust walked something that made every soldier in that room go still. It stood taller than a man, wrapped in dark plated armor that shimmered faintly, its posture calm in a way that felt worse than aggression. Behind it, smaller shapes moved with mechanical precision, gathering equipment, scanning shelves, lifting crates of supplies like they were shopping. Coleman raised his hand, a silent order for everyone to freeze. For one long moment, the invader and the sergeant simply stared at each other across a ruined food court, coffee still cooling on an abandoned tray between them. Then the creature spoke, its voice translated through some device on its chest, flat and almost bored. It said this world's defenses were laughable, and it thanked them for the coffee. It picked up Coleman's mug, drank the entire thing in one motion, and walked out through the hole in the wall as easily as it had walked in. Nobody at the Pentagon believed the first report. A colonel read it twice, asked his aide to read it a third time out loud, and then asked whether anyone on the writing team had been drinking. The words on the page did not change, no matter how many times they were read. An unidentified craft had breached the perimeter of Fort Ashcroft, destroyed a portion of a secured facility, extracted personnel property, and departed without engaging a single weapon system. The facility in question was, according to base records, the food court. By the time General Frank Sullivan arrived at Fort Ashcroft that evening, the footage had already leaked. Not officially, not through any approved channel, but somebody's cell phone camera had caught the ship landing from 200 yards away, and by the time Sullivan's convoy rolled through the gate. That footage had more views than the last 3 presidential debates combined. News anchors were calling it the lunchroom incident. A late-night comedian had already built an entire monologue around it. Somewhere in a Senate office, an aide was drafting a memo asking why the most protected room on a military base turned out to be a sandwich counter. Sullivan did not care about the jokes. He cared about the fact that an alien vessel had walked through 3 layers of security like they were paper, taken what it wanted, and left with what amounted to a mocking comment about the coffee. He stood in the wreckage of Liberty Court that evening with Hayes at his side, boots crunching over broken tile, and asked one simple question. Who was in the room? Hayes gave him the names. Coleman, Walsh, Briggs, Turner, Cooper. 5 soldiers who had stood their ground long enough to get every civilian worker out through the kitchen before the wall came down. 5 soldiers who had not fired a single shot because there had been nothing to fire at, only something to survive. Sullivan asked to see them personally, and that was how Second Squad found itself standing at attention in a briefing room that smelled like fresh paint and old coffee, waiting to hear what happens to soldiers who let a food court get destroyed on their watch. Coleman expected a reprimand. He got something else entirely. Sullivan told them plainly that command had spent the last 6 hours studying every frame of footage from that morning, and the conclusion was simple. The creature had not attacked with intent to conquer. It had scouted, mocked, and left, the way a burglar leaves a note behind just to prove how easy the job was. That meant one thing to Sullivan. This was not an invasion. This was an insult, and the United States Army did not let insults sit unanswered. Briggs, never able to keep quiet for long, asked if this meant they were going to war over lunch. Sullivan did not smile, but something close to it crossed his face. He said this was about more than lunch. It was about a message being sent to every soldier on every base in the country. A message that said American soil, American people, and yes, American food were not open for the taking. If they let this go unanswered, the next visit would not stop at a wall. Intelligence had already traced the departure trajectory of the ship, using radar data nobody expected to be useful for something like this. It led toward a cluster of readings, far beyond anything in the current star charts. Readings that had apparently been quietly logged by deep space monitoring stations for the past 3 years, and dismissed as equipment error. Nobody had believed they were real until that morning. Sullivan assembled a small team, calling it a retaliation unit rather than anything more official sounding, because paperwork moves slowly and Sullivan did not intend to wait for it. Coleman would lead. Walsh, Briggs, Turner, and Cooper would go with him. Because Sullivan had watched the footage of 5 unarmed soldiers protecting civilians against something with technology far beyond anything on Earth. And he decided that was exactly the kind of soldier he wanted walking into hostile territory next. Hayes would coordinate from a support ship, keeping records, managing logistics, and trying, as he always did, to keep order over a group of men who treated chaos like a hobby. Training began within 48 hours. There was no manual for fighting an enemy nobody understood, so Coleman built one from scratch, drilling his squad on movement, cover, and improvisation. Briggs kept asking if there would be alien food where they were going. Turner told him that was the least important question anyone had ever asked before a combat deployment. Walsh said nothing most of the time, but everyone noticed he trained harder than any of them, running drills long after the others had gone to rest, because Walsh did not like unfinished business. And right now, an alien had walked out of Liberty Court with his sergeant's coffee mug and a whole lot of unearned confidence. 3 days later, a modified transport vessel, borrowed from a classified program nobody wanted to explain in detail, lifted off from a hidden runway outside Fort Ashcroft. Inside sat 5 soldiers, one folder full of nervous paperwork, and a mission that boiled down to a single sentence Sullivan had given them at the door. Go find out who broke into our house, and remind them why nobody does that twice. The transport dropped out of hyperspace above a world that looked almost peaceful from orbit, blue oceans, wide green continents, and a scattering of structures too geometric to be natural. Coleman studied the readouts in silence while Hayes, patched in remotely from the support ship, read off what little intelligence they had gathered. The dominant species called themselves the Thren, a name that meant almost nothing to anyone until Hayes added the detail that made Briggs sit up straight. The Thren were, according to every scrap of intercepted communication, obsessed with food, not farming it, judging it. Their entire military culture treated the discovery, theft, and evaluation of foreign cuisine as a mark of conquest, a twisted kind of trophy hunting where the prize was flavor instead of territory. Turner asked if that meant the ship that hit Liberty Court had come all that way just to steal snacks. Hayes confirmed it, adding that early scans of the ship's cargo hold, recovered from wreckage debris near the base, showed traces of coffee grounds, seasoning packets, and what appeared to be an entire crate of hot sauce. Cooper laughed so hard he had to sit down. Coleman did not laugh. He said if an enemy took something from you, it did not matter whether it was a coffee mug or a continent. The principle was the same, and the response had to be the same. The transport set down in a valley outside a fortified compound the size of a small city, ringed with defensive towers and patrol craft moving in slow, lazy circles. Walsh studied the terrain through a scope and reported 6 checkpoints between their position and the central structure, each one guarded by armed Thren troops standing beside hovering combat drones. It looked by every measure impossible to approach quietly. Coleman had a different plan. He had noticed something in the footage from Liberty Court that nobody else had paid attention to, a small detail buried in the chaos. When the Thren commander picked up his coffee mug, its posture had shifted, almost respectful, the way a person handles something they consider valuable. The Thren did not just steal food. They revered it, and that gave Coleman an idea that sounded insane the moment he said it out loud. They were going to walk in like they owned the place, and they were going to act like the food they carried was worth more than every weapon behind those walls. Briggs, predictably, loved the idea immediately. Walsh was less convinced, quietly pointing out that walking towards 6 armed checkpoints with confidence was not usually a strategy that ended well for the soldiers doing the walking. Coleman told him that on Earth, confidence got you arrested. Out here, it might get you respect. They approached the first checkpoint at midday, Briggs walking slightly ahead, carrying an open case of ration packs like he was delivering room service. The Thren guards raised weapons immediately, shouting something through translator boxes that clearly meant stop. Briggs stopped, held up a foil-wrapped ration bar like it was a medal, and announced in his loudest, most unbothered voice that this was the finest food in the galaxy, and they were welcome to have a taste before deciding whether to shoot anyone. The guards hesitated. That hesitation was all Coleman needed. One guard reached out, sniffed the ration bar with obvious suspicion, and took a small bite. His posture changed instantly, shoulders relaxing, weapon lowering an inch. He said something rapid into his own radio, and moments later the checkpoint gate opened without a single shot fired. Turner muttered that this was either the smartest plan he had ever seen or the dumbest, and possibly both at once. It worked twice more, each checkpoint falling to little more than a confident walk and a shared meal, but the fourth checkpoint was different. The guards there did not hesitate. They opened fire the moment the squad came into view, forcing Coleman's team to scatter behind a low defensive wall as plasma bolts chewed through the dirt where Briggs had been standing seconds earlier. Walsh returned fire with controlled bursts, dropping 2 drones out of the air while Cooper dragged Briggs behind cover. Coleman shouted for Turner to find a flanking route, and in the chaos, something became clear that none of them had expected. These guards were not ordinary soldiers. Their armor was heavier, their formation tighter, and their commander's voice, booming through a loudspeaker somewhere behind the checkpoint wall, carried a tone none of the others had used. It said the humans who destroyed their scouting report at the food outpost had been identified, and this time there would be no coffee shared, only consequences. Coleman looked at Walsh across the smoke and dust, both of them realizing the same thing at the same moment. Word had already reached the Thren command about what happened on Earth, and whatever they were walking toward next was not going to open its gates for a ration bar. The fourth checkpoint held for nearly 10 minutes before Coleman gave the order to push through instead of around, because retreating was not something he planned to explain to Sullivan over a secure channel. Walsh moved first, using the wrecked drones as cover, closing the distance in short, controlled bursts while Cooper laid down suppressing fire from the flank. Briggs, of all people, ended up being the one who tipped the fight in their favor, not with a weapon, but with the one thing he always carried without being asked. Pinned behind a crate with plasma fire cutting the air above his head, Briggs noticed a maintenance panel on the nearest combat drone. One that looked almost identical to a coffee dispenser he had fixed back at Liberty Court more times than he could count. He crawled toward it under fire, yanked the panel open, and jammed a ration bar wrapper into the drone's intake vent. The drone sputtered, spun in a slow circle, and crashed directly into 3 Thren guards taking cover behind a barricade. Turner, watching from 20 feet away, shouted that Briggs had just defeated an alien war machine with a snack wrapper, and nobody had a good response to that because it was completely true. The checkpoint fell within minutes after that, guards surrendering with hands raised the moment their central defense line collapsed. Coleman did not celebrate. He pushed the squad forward immediately, knowing that whatever commander had promised consequences over that loudspeaker would not wait around to deliver an apology. The central compound rose ahead of them, a massive structure built from dark metal and curved architecture that looked almost organic, veins of light running along its surface like something alive. Hayes, monitoring from the support ship, warned that scans showed heavy defensive systems inside, along with a life sign cluster near the top level that matched patterns consistent with a command structure. In simple terms, the leader was up there, and he was not alone. Coleman split the squad. Turner and Cooper would secure the ground floor and hold the exit route. Walsh and Briggs would push upward with Coleman, because Coleman had learned by now that Briggs, chaotic as he was, had a habit of solving problems nobody else could see coming. Inside, the compound was quieter than expected, wide corridors lit by strips of pulsing light, the air carrying a strange scent that Briggs immediately identified as some kind of alien seasoning, which earned him a sharp look from Walsh and no further comment. They moved fast, clearing rooms methodically, finding storage chambers filled with confiscated food items from what looked like dozens of different worlds. Jars and containers stacked floor to ceiling like trophies in a twisted museum. Walsh stopped at one shelf and picked up a familiar item, a plain white mug with a chip on the handle, the exact mug that had been taken from Coleman's hand 3 days earlier. He held it up without a word. Coleman took it from him, turned it over once, and set it back down carefully, because a man does not need to say anything when the reason for the entire mission is sitting right there in his hand. They reached the upper level after clearing 2 more defensive teams, both of which folded faster than expected once their commanding officer realized reinforcements were not coming. The final chamber sat behind a wide door reinforced with the same dark metal as the rest of the compound, and Coleman could already hear something on the other side, a slow, deliberate footstep pacing back and forth. Briggs, breathing hard from the climb, asked if they were really about to face down the alien equivalent of a five-star chef standing between them and revenge. Coleman told him that if the description fit, they would deal with it exactly like they dealt with everything else directly, and without wasting time on politeness. Walsh set a demolition charge against the door frame, small and controlled enough to breach without bringing the ceiling down on top of them. Coleman gave the countdown, 3, 2, 1. The door blew inward in a burst of light and smoke, and standing in the center of the chamber, waiting calmly as though he had expected this exact moment for days, stood the same armored figure who had walked through Liberty Court, drank a sergeant's coffee, and left without firing a shot. He did not look surprised. He looked, if anything, pleased. The Thren commander stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by shelves of trophies collected from 100 different battles, his armor catching the low light in slow, shifting patterns. He studied the three soldiers standing in the ruined doorway with an expression that translated, even without words, as something close to satisfaction. His translator crackled to life, and his voice filled the chamber with the same flat, almost bored tone Coleman remembered from the wreckage of Liberty Court. He said the humans had come farther than he expected. He said most species who lost something to the Thren simply mourned the loss and moved on. He said it had been a long time since anyone had followed him home. Coleman told him this was not about mourning. This was about a promise made to every soldier standing behind that wrecked food court 3 days ago. A promise that nobody takes what belongs to Americans and walks away clean. He said the mug on the shelf downstairs, the one with the chipped handle, was going home with them, and so was every ounce of pride the commander thought he had earned that morning. The commander laughed, a short mechanical sound through the translator, and drew a weapon unlike anything the squad had seen so far, a long, curved blade humming with barely contained energy. He said if the humans wanted their trophy back, they would have to prove they deserved it. Walsh moved first, closing the gap fast, but the commander was faster than his size suggested, deflecting the first strike with practiced ease and driving Walsh back with a sweeping counterattack that cracked the tile beneath his boots. Coleman fired twice, both shots glancing off reinforced armor plating that seemed built to shrug off exactly this kind of attack. Briggs, cut off from any clear angle, scanned the room for anything useful and found it sitting on a nearby shelf, an industrial food processor the size of a small generator. Clearly one of the Thren's most prized captured devices from some distant world. He did not ask permission. He grabbed a length of loose cabling, wired it into the processor's power core the way he had seen engineers do a dozen times back at Liberty Court, and shoved the entire unit toward the commander at the exact moment Walsh ducked a killing strike. The processor roared to life, spinning violently, spraying a storm of alien seasoning powder directly into the commander's visor. For the first time since the fight began, the commander stumbled, one hand rising instinctively to clear his vision, and that single second of blindness was all Coleman needed. He closed the distance, drove his shoulder into the commander's chest, and forced him back against the trophy shelf hard enough to send jars and containers crashing to the floor. Walsh recovered fast, sweeping the commander's legs out from under him while Briggs kept the processor running, filling the chamber with a fine cloud of orange dust that made everyone cough. Human and Thren alike. The commander hit the ground, blade skittering out of reach, and for a moment nobody moved. Then, through the haze, his voice crackled through the translator one more time, quieter now, almost respectful. He said the humans fought like they had something worth protecting. He said that was rare, even among species who had fought the Thren for generations. Coleman planted a boot near the fallen blade, not quite touching it, and told him that back home, that was just called being American. He said the fight was over, and unless the commander wanted his entire compound turned into rubble by soldiers who had already survived his best checkpoint guards with nothing but ration bars and stubbornness, he would order a full stand down immediately. The commander considered this for a long moment, then gave the order. Across the compound, weapons lowered. Turner's voice crackled over the radio from the ground floor, confirming that Thren guards were surrendering peacefully, hands raised. Several of them still coughing from the seasoning cloud drifting down through the ventilation system. Briggs shut off the processor, wiped orange dust from his face, and asked if this counted as the best meal prep disaster in Army history. Walsh told him it counted as the reason nobody was ever letting him near kitchen equipment again. Coleman picked up the chipped mug from the wreckage of the shelf, turned it over once in his hand, and allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. The transport lifted off from that world 3 hours later, carrying 5 tired soldiers, 1 recovered coffee mug, and a compound full of Thren troops left to explain to their leadership exactly how a handful of humans had walked in, defeated their strongest checkpoint, and marched out again with their commander's pride in pieces. Hayes met them on the landing pad back at Fort Ashcroft, his folder tucked under his arm as always, though this time it held something new. A full incident report that Sullivan had personally requested be written, without a single word softened. General Sullivan walked the length of the landing pad slowly, looking over each member of Second Squad the way a man studies something he is still not sure he believes. He asked Coleman for the short version first. Coleman handed him the mug. Sullivan turned it over once, saw the familiar chip in the handle, and let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. He said the Pentagon would need a full written report by morning, and he already knew nobody there was going to believe a word of it, but that was a problem for tomorrow. Word of what happened spread through the base faster than any official memo could contain. Soldiers who had once quietly mocked Liberty Court's ridiculous security clearance now walked past it with something closer to pride. Carol, the counter worker who had served coffee there for longer than most soldiers had been alive, hung the chipped mug behind the register herself, refusing every offer to have it cleaned or repaired. She told anyone who asked that the chip was the whole point. It was proof that some things were worth going to war for, even if those things were as simple as a decent cup of coffee and the principle of not letting anyone push you around. Briggs became something of a legend among the enlisted ranks, not for his marksmanship, which remained mediocre at best, but for what soldiers started calling the seasoning storm, a nickname that followed him for the rest of his career, whether he liked it or not. He tried, more than once, to explain that it had been a tactical decision born from split-second thinking under fire. Nobody believed him, and honestly, by that point, he had stopped trying to convince them. Walsh returned to his usual quiet routine, though soldiers now treated him with a certain wary respect, the kind reserved for a man who had traded blows with an armored alien commander and walked away without a scratch worth mentioning. He never talked about it much. When asked, he usually just said the fight had been shorter than most training exercises Coleman put them through, which was, in its own way, the highest compliment Walsh knew how to give. Turner and Cooper resumed their long-running debate about pizza toppings almost immediately, though now it carried a strange new authority. Since both of them had technically fought aliens over the principle of good food, and won. Cooper liked to joke that pineapple on pizza was nothing compared to what they had already survived, and Turner, for once, did not have a comeback ready. Sullivan made sure Liberty Court was rebuilt within the month, this time with reinforced walls that could have stopped a small tank. Though everyone quietly agreed the original security had never really been about walls in the first place. It had been about the idea that some things, no matter how small they seemed on paper, deserved to be protected simply because they mattered to the people who relied on them every single day. Reports filtered back through classified channels over the following weeks, suggesting the Thren had pulled their remaining scout ships out of the region entirely. Word having spread through their ranks about the compound that fell to 5 soldiers, a coffee mug, and a food processor turned makeshift weapon. Whether that story grew taller with every retelling among the Thren the way it did among American soldiers, nobody could say for certain, but Sullivan liked to think it had. Because a little bit of legend never hurt anyone, especially when it kept the right kind of enemy at a distance. Coleman kept the story simple whenever new recruits asked him about it, which they always did within their first week on base. Usually right after someone told them the old joke about Liberty Court needing a higher clearance than the missile bunker. He would tell them it was true, all of it, and that the lesson was not really about aliens or checkpoints or seasoning powder. It was about the fact that when someone comes into your house and takes something that belongs to you, you do not let it go, no matter how small it seems. because small things add up to everything a person is willing to stand for. Then he would nod toward the register, toward a chipped white mug sitting on a little shelf behind the counter, and tell them that was where the whole thing started. And that was exactly where it belonged. If you made it this far, drop a comment and let us know which part of this fight hit hardest for you. Share this video with someone who needs a good laugh today. And hit subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Because out there, somewhere past the stars, the Thren are already telling their own version of what happened at that food court. And the United States Army is not finished writing this story yet.